We are living in unprecedented times. The COVID virus has had a terrible impact on our country. Protest over the murder of black men and women at the hands of police, unemployment at an all-time high, and an election just around the corner. Now, Twitter, for the first time, decided to fact-check one of Donald Trump's tweets by putting a warning next to it reading, "misleading or false," in response to the president's statement about voter fraud. There have been a lot of false statements coming from this president, but this one is particularly dangerous. In the past, he claimed that 3 million people voted illegally in the 2016, without any evidence whatsoever. Now, the Republicans have long claimed voter fraud as a justification for restricting voting, including voter ID laws and other restrictive voting rules. But the fact is, there is almost no in-person voting fraud.
Nope.
In 2016, only 4 documented cases out of 129 million votes cast. But election fraud is very real. Politicians have been cheating in elections since long before I was born. Both Democrats and Republicans try to get an advantage in an election. But the Republicans make the Democrats look like school children. Here's some little-known history to get things started. In 1979, Jimmy Carter was our president, and by most accounts, a very decent man. He was no saint, but given his humanitarian work after he left office, he may be close. The times were tough in America back then. There was gasoline rationing, interest rates were above 15%, inflation was through the roof, but possibly the biggest news at the time was that 52 Americans were taken hostage at the American Embassy in Tehran. This had huge consequences for the 1980 election. A former governor and actor, Ronald Reagan, was challenging Carter for the job. Now, the sentiment at the time was that if Carter could get the hostages freed, he would easily win the election. So in order to rig the election for Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Reagan's VP pick and former director of the CIA, orchestrated a secret deal with the Iranians. If they would hold the hostages prisoner until after the election, then we would sell them weapons. And it worked. Carter was unable to free the hostages, and that made him look weak. Reagan won in a landslide, and the hostages were released on January 20th, 1981, on Inauguration Day.
Now, day one. Day one of Ronald Reagan's presidency, and day one of freedom for 52 Americans. Though thousands of miles apart, these two historic events moved almost on parallel tracks today. The new president had not been in office an hour when the former hostages became free men and women again.
But the secret didn't stay buried long. In his second term, the truth came out and was known as the Iran-Contra affair. And the secret deal with the Iranians became known as the October Surprise. But that wasn't the end of election rigging. They knew that their policies only benefit a small portion of the American people, primarily large corporations and the wealthy. So they needed some new tricks to stay in power. In the 2000 election, it looked like George W. Bush might lose a close race with Al Gore, even after his campaign manager, Kathleen Harris, the Secretary of State in Florida, had thrown tens of thousands of people off the voting rolls, mostly for the crime of voting while black. There was a partial recount ordered, and that must have scared the Republican Party because they sent dozens of operatives down to harass the election officials.
On November 22nd of the year 2000, weeks after the presidential election that year, we still did not know who had won Florida and who had therefore won the presidency. Over 10,000 ballots remained to be counted by the Miami-Dade Elections Board. When Republican operatives, who the Bush campaign had flown in from around the country, heard that that count in Miami was going to go forward, the count of those 10,000 plus remaining ballots, those GOP operatives decided they would physically shut down that count. The two direct organizers of the mob that turned up at the Miami elections office were New York State Republican Party chairman at the time, Brendan Quinn, and New York Republican Congressman John Sweeney. The mob that the GOP sent to stop that count in Miami was billed at the time as a spontaneous grassroots uprising, one that just happened to be made up of no one at all from Miami, all Republican national operatives, including at least a half dozen who, according to IRS records, received payment for their services from the Bush-Cheney recount committee. Here were the Brooks Brothers rioters, just a bunch of ordinary Americans who wanted to see justice done, who were moved to spontaneous protest. Rioter 1 here, Tom Pyle, an aide to Republican Congressman Tom DeLay. Rioter 2, Gary Melfris, former staff director of the House Judiciary Subcommittee on Criminal Justice. Rioter 3, Rory Cooper, staff member with the National Republican Congressional Committee. Rioter 4, Kevin Smith, former House Republican conference analyst. Rioter 5, Stephen Brophy, former aide to Senator Fred Thompson. Rioter 6, Matt Schlapp, Bush campaign staffer. Rioter 7, Roger Morse, aide to Republican Congressman Van Hillary. Rioter 8, Dwayne Gibson, aide to Republican Congressman Don Young. Rioter 9, Chuck Royal, aide to then Republican Congressman Jim DeMint. And Rioter 10, Lena McConkey, former assistant to Republican Jim Ross Lightfoot. Many of the Brooks Brothers rioters went on to pretty good jobs in the Bush-Cheney administration.
The Republican Party couldn't allow democracy to play out. So they went to their allies in the U.S. Supreme Court and asked them to help. And they did. They stopped all the vote counting, ensuring a win for Bush. It was such a bad decision that even the judges themselves said it should not set precedent. And according to most legal scholars, it was a terrible decision that thwarted the will of the voters. Then again, in 2004, Ken Blackwell, Ohio's Secretary of State, and another Bush campaign official promised to deliver the state for Bush. What followed was more shady dealings and uncertainty with the vote count. In both elections, the person in charge of the voting worked for the Bush campaign. In 2008, after Obama scored a big win with enough votes to overcome any tampering, they knew they would have to up their game if they intended to stay in power. So they adopted several strategies to ensure Republican victories no matter what. Extreme gerrymandering. That's where politicians draw interesting voting districts to advantage themselves or their party. And in 2008, after getting whooped by Obama, Karl Rove, former advisor to George W. Bush, along with Ed Gillespie, the former head of the Republican National Committee, devised a plan to take control of the country. David Daley lays it all out in his 2016 book, Rat Fucked. Beginning in 2010, the GOP sought control of governorships and state legislators for the express purpose of controlling redistricting to protect House Republican seats. REDMAP, short for Redistricting Majority Project, targeted swing states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, with Democratic majorities, but which could be swung towards Republican with some creative redistricting. Launched in 2010 at an estimated cost of around $30 million. Now, that's a lot of money for state and local races, but it worked. After the 2010 census, they deployed a computer program called Maptitude. It used data to know how virtually every person in America voted and would likely vote in the future. And then they gerrymandered the hell out of those states. It was described as cracking and packing, breaking apart Democratic districts to dilute their voting power, or packing all the Democrats into districts, thereby limiting their representation and ensuring Republican majorities, even when they lost the popular vote. In 2012, the Republicans won several districts and retained control of the U.S. House of Representatives by a 33-seat majority, despite the fact that Democrats won the popular vote by more than 1 million. For instance, in Wisconsin, Democrats got 52% of the vote, but Republicans held a 5-3 seat advantage. With similar results in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and others, resulting in minority rule. So when courts began to step in and put an end to this extreme gerrymandering, the Republicans added other methods of rigging elections. Voter suppression. Their goal is to make voting as hard as possible for Democrats. There are several ways to accomplish this. First is purging people off the voting rolls, stripping them of their right to vote. States are supposed to clear voting rolls of people who may have died or moved out of state or might be in prison, depending on what state you're in. Another target of the Republican Party is to eliminate early voting.
Nope.
The reason we vote on Tuesdays goes all the way back to when many Americans still lived on farms. But why we're still doing it, I don't know. But for many working class Americans, it can be really hard to get time off to go and vote. There is no national holiday for voting. Another tactic is closing polling places, primarily in cities, heavily Democratic areas. The result can be long lines with people waiting up to 8 hours or more to vote. In Wisconsin's 2020 primary, the city of Milwaukee normally should have had 180 polling places. There were only 5 for more than 18,000 voters who cast ballots in person during the pandemic. After the 2000 election, our government turned our voting systems over to private corporations, many with ties to the Republican Party. They sold us electronic voting machines that could not be audited, but could easily be hacked. We are still using many of these flawed machines today. One particularly troubling area is vote tabulation. That's where all the local voting machines send their vote totals often to a single computer that gathers the votes and determines the winners. These machines are controlled by the Secretary of State, who could change the outcome of the election and nobody would know because there are no paper ballots to recount. Can a ballot spoil? Every election, thousands of ballots are discarded as spoiled. A ballot is considered spoiled if an election authority determines that it is invalid and thus not included in the vote count. Yeah, there is no opportunity for cheating there. Ballots are rejected for reasons as subjective as variations in a signature. Hell, my signature has never been the same twice. Election officials have incredible power over whose votes get counted and whose doesn't. During the 2018 election in North Carolina, Leslie McCrae Dowis, a Republican operative, ran an illegal absentee ballot gathering operation on behalf of a GOP candidate, Mark Harris. He was indicted on multiple criminal charges. Harris's people gathered absentee ballots, then filled out and forged signatures, or they just trashed Democratic ballots. The Republicans have long claimed voter fraud as justification for these things. But that's bullshit. I don't know anybody who would risk 5 years in jail to cast a ballot, especially when only half of the people in America vote. Now, some of you may claim that both sides do the same thing and I'm just attacking one party, but that's not the case. Yes, Democrats gerrymander too, but nowhere near this scale or with the national agenda. This is something that every American should protest. We're told that this is a government of, by, and for the people, and we're the ones choosing who represents us. Unlike Russia, China, or North Korea, where elections are just a sham to paper over a despotic dictatorship, we are supposed to be a free country, and our vote should count. Here are a few things that we can do. We can petition our government, both state and national, to pass voting rights laws. There is no national law guaranteeing our right to vote. We need national standards that all states must follow. Ensure all voting machines generate a paper ballot that can be audited and free from hacking. We can adopt ranked choice voting. That's where a voter gets to pick a first, second, and third choice. If their first choice doesn't make the cut, their vote rolls over to their second choice, and so on. It's used in more than 20 cities and the entire state of Maine. This allows us to vote for third parties without wasting a vote. So if you don't like the way things are going, get out and vote, and don't let anybody stop you.